call Judge.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're back again. These presentations and panels just keep getting better and better. So this has been a very exciting conference so far. So it's my job to introduce the moderator of our next panel, Dick Cunningham. Dick has been a longtime friend and associate and member of the executive committee of the Canada-U.S. Law Institute. He goes way back to the early days of coming to Cleveland at the invitation of Henry King and speaking to the Greater Cleveland International Lawyers Group. And it's an honor to have him. He's got more than 40 years of experience as an international trade lawyer. He's a partner at Steptoe Johnson in Washington, where he leads that practice. And when he's not in Cleveland, he's normally in Korea or Japan or someplace else working on trade agreements. So without further ado, Dick.
Thanks. That's a nice introduction. It's not my favorite introduction. My favorite introduction was an Undersecretary of Commerce who once introduced me as Dick Cunningham, the leading practitioner, and I'm thinking, boy, this guy knows his stuff, the leading practitioner of the black art of international trade law, which I proudly carry that mantle with me. This panel is a great panel, and it's really an important panel. I hope that all of you picked up at the desk this little brochure, Canada-U.S. Trade Facts. And if you turn to it, look at the table inside of the 10 leading U.S. Exports to Canada and the 10 leading U.S. goods imports from Canada, it's obvious that the auto sector dominates U.S.-Canada trade. It's 44% of those 10 top U.S. exports. It's 55% of the top U.S. goods import from Canada. That's true in a number of the U.S. trade relationships. Auto trade was and remains the key issue in the U.S.-Korea trade negotiations, and it is central to the NAFTA negotiations. And that's what we're going to discuss here today. We're going to discuss auto trade, and we're going to discuss NAFTA. We've got a great panel to do it. Those of you who are particularly observant probably have noticed this is not Ms. Wilson sitting next to me, but
Only on Saturdays.
Dan Uxo is an embodiment of the clear rule that the Canada-U.S. Law Institute is the path that leads on to greatness. Dan has been a long-time associate. He worked with us for years and years, and he is now a leading practitioner of international trade law, working at the firm of Dickinson Wright, where he specializes in trade policy issues and is working deeply in the NAFTA negotiations. To his left is John Tennant. John's formerly Consul General of Canada in Detroit. His distinguished career in public service has focused on trade, investment, and economic development. And today he's the Managing Director of the W2N2 Partnership and Principal of the Global Investment Attraction. And of particular interest for this panel, his companies were commissioned by Global Affairs Canada a few years ago to produce a global automotive sector strategy for Canada, which the NAFTA renegotiation is probably well on its way to disrupting. Finally, on my far left is Basil Hargrove. Buzz Hargrove was national president of the Canadian Auto Workers, where he was and is one of the most recognized labor leaders in Canada. Mr. Hargrove is now distinguished visiting professor at the Ted Rogers School of Management, where he's co-director of the Center for Labor Management Relations. And if you look at it in the brochures that I've handed out, you'll notice one of the things that I've always thought is a distinction between Canadian labor and American labor is that in the spelling that Canadian labor has a U in it, and American labor sometimes lacks that. Let me turn first, if I can, to John Tennant. John, I'd like to put the NAFTA talks on automobiles in a bit of context, going back a few years, and it is sort of a, how did we get here at this point?
Thank you very, very much, Dick.
In addition to my spell in Detroit, I also served twice in Japan, late 70s, early 80s, and then again in the 90s. Coming to Cusley is comforting, I find. Lawyers, trade policy people are committed to working out problems within certain norms. That's even more comforting in a world now that seems to be a bit rudderless and lawless. So it's nice to hang out a bit here. But regrettably, as I think we have come to find out, international trade, trade and economic relations have long been political. And very evidently, they still are. This NAFTA renegotiation is to a very considerable extent, and it applies to auto, déjà vu all over again. There are two aspects that I think really express the political. The first is, I think history has shown us that when a country aggressively grabs market share in the U.S. in a major sector, as Mexico has in autos, they should anticipate that there are going to be some restrictive countermeasures on the part of the U.S. From a Canadian point of view, of course, we've been living since the 1980s with lumber, where the industry in Canada has certainly found a growing market and has not been hesitant to exploit it. But time and time again, we have ended up with responses from the U.S. that have usually led to some type of negotiated settlement. It is a very great generalization, but I think it could be said that in contrast to lumber, the Canadian steel industry over time has been much more measured in the extent to which it has marched into the U.S. market, knowing that it would face actions, some of which it's managed to avoid. In the case of the automotive sector, we started, of course, with an automotive pact that did allow Canada the comfort of being able to set Canadian content requirements. That was fine for a while, but we, of course, in the 1980s, ran into the incursion of the Japanese automotive industry into the United States and into Canada. The U.S. confronted Japan over exports, and as the Japanese were growing the market, some would say in part because of having fuel-efficient, high-quality vehicles, the U.S. ultimately won voluntary export restraints during the Reagan administration. Of course, there's some people on the front lines now who were around then too. And the Japanese were pressured to establish production in the U.S. Canada got into the game too. When the Japanese seemed only to be paying attention to the U.S. and pressure that was being applied, Canada's then Minister of Industry, Trade and Commerce, Ed Lumley, got Japan's attention by moving beyond what anybody would normally recommend by having every Japanese car that arrived in Vancouver inspected by customs officers. And that got some Japanese attention, and Canada then proceeded to find very innovative ways, new ways to incent the Japanese to be investing in Canada as well as in the United States. Then, of course, we moved into the opportunity of Canada-U.S. free trade and then NAFTA. The U.S. was certainly interested in the Canada-U.S. free trade agreement on the auto front because of how imaginative we'd become in beginning to introduce some new ideas like our duty remission incentives. So we ended up in a situation where we refashioned the relationship. In fact, there was, out of the initial bilateral agreement, some things that didn't work as perfectly as they might have. And in the NAFTA agreement, one of Canada's good reasons to be in it was that the automotive content provisions that Canada had thought were in the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement weren't interpreted identically by the U.S., and indeed it represented some risk to Canada. Now, of course, here we are with a situation where NAFTA has created opportunity in Mexico, and where there was literally, I think we'd all agree, a stampede to investment in auto production in Mexico up until a little less than 2 years ago. That stampede is one that clearly President Trump has sought to corral. I mean, there is a difference now. It is more political than it may have been before, but the trend, I think, is very, very clear. And do remember, I think it's important as the discussion goes on about content, not only was there the issue of sorting out an agreed definition of content in the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement and then at the higher level in NAFTA, but in the Canadian case, the automotive content provisions in the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership have certainly not been to the liking of most of the Canadian auto parts industry. There will be a lot of eagle eyes on how all of this comes forward. I think this paints the context of politics really rules. And one is the importance of auto and the question of imbalance or change occurring. Because it is so important, it invites a political response. Arguably, too, just as a final note, steel has always been very much in that category. And it certainly seems to me that steel is very much at the foundation of U.S. objectives when it comes to the automotive sector, too, as reflected in the content requirements. Drilling back to make sure that that becomes part of the content area.
I just want to tell a short anecdote to underscore the truth of what you were saying about politics really determines trade actions by governments in an important, economically powerful industry like autos. You referred to the Japanese voluntary export restraints. That's one of the favorite moments that I look back on in my career. There was a real movement by both the industry and the union to take measures against Japanese imports, which, as you say, were greatly assuming as a dominant role in the U.S. market. The industry was mixed, as it often is in the auto industry about this, and the administration worked with the United Auto Workers to file a case under Section 201, our safeguard proceeding. We call it the escape clause, because the administration said we have to have a legal basis to do a negotiation with Japan to get them to restrain exports. So I was in the United Airlines lounge at Dulles Airport on the day that the International Trade Commission was to vote on that case, and everybody was absolutely convinced that they were going to vote to restrict imports. In walked Bob Hertzstein, who was the Undersecretary of Commerce at that time, and I said, "Why are you here?" He said, "Well, we're anticipating the vote from the ITC today, and I and my team here are going to go off to Japan, probably same flight you're on, to negotiate the voluntary export restraints." Guy comes running in a few minutes later, beckons to Hertzstein to come over. Hertzstein comes over, talks to him. Talk gets very agitated. Hertzstein comes back. All the red corpuscles have drained out of his face. He looks terribly white. I said, "What happened?" He said, "The ITC voted no. They voted no import restraints, no injury caused by Japanese imports." And I said, "Oh." And what happened? He said, well, I called the president. I said, well, I suppose he's told you to cash in your ticket, go on back. He said, oh, hell no. We're going to go over now, negotiate the restraints. And that's what they did. One might assume then that the legalities here play a somewhat tenuous role in bringing policy to a conclusion in an industry like this. Let me begin this discussion by asking what I think is a fundamental question that you don't often ask at this juncture in a trade negotiation, because you get so bound up in the intricacies of what offer's been made, what counteroffer has been made, that sort of thing. I'd like us to step back and say, what are we trying to do here? What do the governments want to achieve in NAFTA on autos? What does the industries in the three countries want to achieve in auto trade? And what do the unions want to achieve in auto trade? Because I think as we discuss that, it'll give a little better window into why some proposals have traction, why some don't, but also as to why some interests may not be what are really guiding these things, and the politics instead may be guiding. And Buzz, maybe I could start with you and talk about labor's view on this. And if you could, I know that you come from a Canadian standpoint, but I know that you and the UAW worked hand in glove on all these things over the years. So perhaps you could give a by-country labor view on this.
A Canadian and view and a labor view.
Yeah.
I'm glad, Dick, you set me straight, because I've always believed that it was George H.W. Bush's trip to Japan where he threw up in the lap of the Prime Minister. It really was a spark that got the negotiations.
That's a negotiating technique for you.
But I start from the premise, one of the panelists earlier said that NAFTA enjoyed a lot of support in Canada today. Well, I can tell you, it's not amongst the labor movement or our membership. Everyone's very, very upset with NAFTA, and for good reason. I started in the auto industry back in 1964, and I was around. I remember demonstrating in 1965 in January and February before the deal was signed, demonstrating for content rules and ratios of sales to market share be put in the agreement. And I can understand why people think that Canadian negotiators are unpleasant. I've been on the receiving end of Simon Reisman's tongue on a few occasions, and yes, he would leave you with the impression that all Canadians are unpleasant. But he did come out of that bargaining with those kind of rules. We had a sales to market ratio that was by category. Trucks were a category, buses, automobiles were their own category, and each company had to meet their share in each area, and they had to, if they didn't, they had to pay duty on every vehicle they sold in Canada that year. So if you only built 750 vehicles and you sold 1,000, you paid duty on 1,000 vehicles. And it was a very effective tool, given that we were the smallest player in the trade agreement, and we had no auto industry in Canada that was owned by Canadians. It was owned by Americans, and that's something people should think about as they're debating what this NAFTA discussion is all about today. These are American companies that still own the auto industry. We have a couple of parts makers like Magna that do very, very well, but the reality is the auto producers are either American or Japanese. It's not Canadian producers are going to have a big advantage. But we progressed into the free trade agreement where we lost some of the ability to force the companies to invest in Canada. And by the way, I should point out that even though, contrary to popular thinking, if you had protectionist measures in place, the industry would go fat and lazy. We built, with those rules in place, one of the most cost-effective, one of the most productive and best quality industries anywhere in the world. And it was to the amazement of a lot of people who said that can't happen if you have content rules in place. So we moved through that. The free trade agreement started to dismantle that, and we've seen ourselves start to lose jobs. And then NAFTA came along, and we opposed NAFTA. We demonstrated. We done everything. I said to myself, as I was flying down here this morning, where the hell was Donald Trump when we needed him? We were making the same arguments that he's making today. I don't agree with Donald Trump on much, but that's one thing I do agree on. There's an unfairness in trade right across the board, but especially in the auto sector. But Canada is not part of that. We've lost 4 plants in the same time frame that the Americans lost 10 plants. We've lost almost 100,000 jobs in the auto sector in Canada. Our deficit with Mexico is quadrupled to $18 billion a year during that period. And we've watched new investment go into Mexico and go into the southern United States. Well, Canada got zero over the last 5 years. We have had no opportunity to improve on what is a great workforce, incredible skills, an incredible education system, and an opportunity and a willingness to work with the industry to make sure that we recognize we're a small player and we better do things right if we're going to get our fair share of production. So we would not be disappointed if NAFTA disappears. I don't see, matter of fact, I think it's exaggerated, including by some of the panelists in this room today, the impact of NAFTA. Think about it. When we signed NAFTA, the political instability in Mexico was the best safeguard we had. I remember a lot of discussion and dialogue with the companies and with the government, saying that as long as there's this political instability in Mexico, they're not going to invest. They're not going to put major investments and gamble on whether or not it's going to be nationalized or they're going to have more rules put on them. And that worked for a few years. But Mexico did 2 things during that period. Its politics have become fairly stable. You don't have the same uncertainty. Today, you have it in the United States today under the Trump administration, the kind of uncertainty that the industry faced when making decisions to go to Mexico during that period. So it's a different world, and so the Mexico today they're well positioned. They have the same technology. I toured an engine plant in Mexico that was owned by Fiat, and I toured a Ford engine plant, and I toured a couple in Canada. Same technology. The only difference in those facilities in Mexico was they had more people. Why? Because they're paying them $3 or $4 an hour, depending on who you listen to, maybe $5 or $6 an hour all in, and they can afford to have more people to make sure they have checks and balances in the production system. Because we have 2 problems with Mexico. The instability is gone, and they have this incredible low-wage base that nobody can compete with. And if anybody thinks that somehow Mexico is going to sign an agreement that forces them to raise wages to $15 an hour, you're living in a dream world. That ain't going to happen. Not in my lifetime. They would just soon see the agreement go. The companies are going to go there anyway. Even if it's in a non-NAFTA environment, they're going to invest in Mexico. So we got those 2 problems in Mexico, but we also have the problem of right-to-work states in the United States that allow people to pay a lot less and allow freeloaders to stay in and get the same representation as people who pay union dues. Now imagine, most people in this room are lawyers. Just think about it. You're a lawyer. I walk into your office and I say, I want you to represent me on a case. It's going to be a couple of months, but I'm not going to pay you. And you got another customer sitting outside. He says, I'm going to pay. You can't go by me. You got to first represent me under the laws of the right to work laws in the United States. You got to represent me as the same as the guy waiting with no pay. Now imagine your legal office and how long you'd stay in business if that was the case. Well, that's what we face as a labor movement in the United States and Canada as a result of right to work laws. There's been an enormous amount of investment went into the right to work states in the United States, and do we think we can do? We've been screaming about it as a labor movement during the discussion, the dialogue, and in the media. But do we really think that the United States federal government's going to bring in a law outlining outlawing the right of states in the United States to bring in right to work. Not a chance. You're living in a dream world. I keep telling my colleagues, raise it. Of course, people should be aware of it. But if you somehow think that's going to change things very much, then you're wrong. You're living on and on. That's not going to happen. So these NAFTA discussions are interesting. Some are say to me, where's it all going? I don't know. If you went by Donald Trump today, you'd say we're pretty good shape. He's saying some positive things. But wait till tomorrow, he'll do something entirely different or say something entirely different. So trying to read him is like trying to read. I can't repeat what went through my mind, but that's just not in the cards. I think the most we can do is get rid of the uncertainty. And that's going to help investment. That's going to help sales. People are not clear what they should buy today because of the uncertainty of where it's going to be built. There's a lot of Americans, and I just spent 3 months in Florida. Loved it. A lot of Americans are looking at buying new vehicles. They're going to say, I'm going to wait and see how this thing unfolds. I want to see where they're built. I'd like to buy a vehicle that's built in the United States. I might consider Canada, but I'm not going to buy something that's built in Mexico. So then you've got others that are thinking about investment, and they're saying, well, I'm going to wait till the cloud clears and we know what the rules are before I make any major investment. And to me, that makes sense. Business people, if you're going to put a lot of money on the table, you better know what the rules of the game are. So the most, I believe, that can come out of this is to end the uncertainty and let business move on, and let us continue to debate what's in the best interest of each country.
John, let me turn to you. Looking at the question I posed, which is what do the governments want? What do the various constituents want? What are we trying to do in this negotiation? We've got a problem that's been posed to us here, which is a clear and obvious concern that you have a very low-paid labor force in Mexico that attracts investment away from and production away from Canada and the United States, and you've had a pessimism expressed that you could ever get wage rates up by agreement between the United States and Canada. There are other ways that are being talked about to address this, John. How do you see these things going? How do you see what do you see as the goals of the U.S. and Canada in this negotiation? You.
Maybe it oversimplifies it, but now that the Trump administration has so many balls in play, and I quote from the 11 winning negotiating tactics from Donald Trump's Art of the Deal, I never get too attracted to one deal or one approach. I keep a lot of balls in the air because most deals fall out, no matter how promising they seem at first. And with the additional actions that are out there, with more to play with, it seems to me that though the time frame, as has been discussed, has really been thrown off, there is some opportunity if the U.S. can get something it can present as making future investment in Mexico in the near term less attractive, some fancy arrangement with respect to costs being reflected somehow, that there is the potential to capitalize on that and give him something to walk away with. I think there's one other aspect to this in terms of what might come out, though, is not only does Trump have more things out there, NAFTA is not the singular policy issue in terms of the U.S. automotive industry. There are fuel economy standards that are out there, U.S. corporate taxes, and part of that has been the immediate write-off of capital goods and what's a more capital-intensive industry. There's, of course, a self-interest that they have in various of these actions against China. GM producing more automobiles in China than in the United States, and big users of aluminum as well as steel. So there's a lot out there for the automotive industry, and there be for them some trade-offs, and it won't be pure and simple. They could accept something in NAFTA that's not from their point of view perfect, but if they're getting something else somewhere else, that would be a factor.
Dan, you want to talk a little bit about who wants to get what out of this?
On the big picture, sure. Just first and foremost, again, it's a privilege to be here, and thank you for the invitation at Dickinson Wright. We are a continual sponsor here. We were a little late to the game this time just because, frankly, we didn't know if we could be here given the way that the NAFTA schedule was, and then I forgot I had a trip out with our U.S. Ambassador, Kelly Craft, out to Calgary. So when Ann Wilson, who I work regularly with, we're proud members of MEMA. I think we were one of the founding members of MEMA at Dickinson Wright. As some of you know, Dickinson Wright was founded in Detroit. The firm incorporated Chrysler. Auto is part of our DNA. And we're, of course, proud members of APMA with Flavio Volpe and the gang. So Ann and I talked, but I forgot that I was going to be in Calgary when we were in D.C. earlier this week, and she said, could you cover Cooley at the end of the week? I think I've probably come the farthest, even though I live 2 hours away. So I flew in last night. That's a little bit of the head cold. But actually, Ann and I, about a month ago when we were in Mexico City, sat down and we're talking about this presentation. And we kind of laughed as we walked out of the door after having breakfast and said, you know, it'll be funny, will this presentation be the same a month from now in April 2018 versus March of 2018? And I'm not sure it's the same presentation that I would have gave yesterday, frankly, in terms of how fast things are changing on the ground. We are in rule of origin negotiations. They're just wrapping up, as I said earlier today, at least for this session. Just big picture, looking at this, in the NAFTA itself, we keep using the term modernization, and I think that term means different strokes to different folks. In the sense that modernization means something very different to the Canadians and Mexicans than it's meaning to the Americans. And so I always go back to what President Trump said on February 2nd of 2017 when he met with House Ways and Means and Senate Finance right after, a couple weeks after the inauguration, after the flurry, activity that we saw. He said, I'm going to renovate the NAFTA. And I thought, there's the perfect word for a real estate mogul turned president. And that's exactly what we're doing. There's really three buckets. Bucket number one is, and this was talked about earlier today by Peter and Jeffrey, where we're just putting on a fresh coat of paint on about 14 chapters. Anti-corruption, competition clause, small and medium-sized enterprise. That's my favorite one, North American small and medium-sized enterprise dialogue. I worked in government, Canadian and U.S., for 15 years. Whenever you see the word dialogue, it means there ain't nothing in it. But so, and those are the things that are, and frankly, we're talking a lot about those this week, and I think, as somebody said earlier, about 10 chapters could be closed. It's those. It's the fresh coat of paint. Then there's the upgrades, where we're putting in new fixtures, upgrading the appliance in this renovation. That's the digital chapter. The customs and trade facilitation chapter, telecom, financial services. And there's a lot of good news. People don't generally focus on that aspect of it, getting this deal to the 21st century. Now, the problem is that's where the Canadians and Mexicans wanted to stop. So when you ask me what were the Canadian and Mexicans' proposal was, hey, if we're coming to this dance on NAFTA, we're going to end there. Let's just have the good stuff. And the problem is they don't live here in Ohio or Western PA, Western New York, Southeast, that state up north, Wisconsin. These are areas where I was involved in the presidential campaign. We run a lot of the congressional races. We're running Senate races right now. I kind of concur with the earlier sentiments that I think even if we get an agreement in the coming days and weeks, there's no way it's getting passed in 2018 in the U.S. Congress because Governor Blanchard said it. If I'm a Democrat, why would I possibly vote for this deal? Because even if I like it, even if it's UAW, if I'm Sherrod Brown, why would I take it? I could wait until 2018 and maybe get a blue wave, then I got to deal with AMLO and a progressive government in Canada. I could get a better deal, probably. So if it needs Democrat votes, it ain't going to get done. And yes, it needs Democrat votes because the constituency right now that's most anti-NAFTA in the United States is white males 55 and older, and if it needs to be said, Republicans. I mean, that's what all polling is showing us right now. So there is not a clean sweep in the lame duck as one would predict in a Republican Congress. And if you doubt me on that, look at health care, look at tax reform, and look at what we just recently saw. So But there was this last bucket, and this is what we're talking about right now, which are, we're knocking down walls in this NAFTA. And specifically, some have called these the poison pills. Automotive is at the top of the list. Government procurement, we'll talk more about dispute resolution, the sunset clause, labor, which I would put in the so-called poison pill knockdown wall, but that's being dealt with a little bit. And one nobody's talking about is textiles, which is a huge issue, particularly in this part of the world, in places like Columbus or in the Carolinas and elsewhere. And so what the objective, and into that as well was seasonal produce, as I noted earlier, that is a big issue for our friends in Mexico. The U.S. policy was very simple. They want to stop Dick Cunningham's clients from bringing in steel into the United States. All of us, I'm kidding, of course, but not really. But any of us that were around the table with Secretary Ross last year, and because USTR Lighthizer wasn't confirmed, we all heard the same story. There is a piece of Chinese steel that goes to Japan, gets exported duty-free into Mexico or Canada, and becomes an exhaust pipe in your car. We heard that story. Now, none of our auto companies could actually find that piece of steel, but that was the story that we heard. So priority number one was cutting down the back door, because as we know, this Bob Lighthizer and others were China warriors. Mm-hmm. And so shutting the back door was priority number one. And priority number two was making it as difficult to do business in Mexico as possible. And so that may be through a wage increase. So as we talk about the specific proposals, it also means something like eliminating Chapter 11, investor protections in Mexico. But those are the two major priority areas, and then getting it through Congress. And one of the things that I think got lost when we started calling these things poison pills was the actual strategy for looking at that basket of issues. Some of it was policy. Bob Lighthizer just doesn't like Chapter 19. And there's a spirited discussion within this room, and there historically has been. I've been coming around here for 20 years. We've been talking about Chapter 19, I think, every year since the day I walked in the door in 11 to boot. But if you look at what that laundry list was, it was, I got to get votes from this from auto districts of Republicans and Democrats, so I better have an auto proposal for them. I got to have textile votes, so I need votes from the Carolinas. I'm going to need seasonal produce so I can get votes for the great tomato wars from Florida. Chapter 19 is synonymous with softwood lumber, as was said earlier. So while it has this kind of life of its own in Canada, on the Hill for Pacific Northwest, U.S. Southeast, that's softwood. So in supply management, I've been in meetings with Chuck Schumer with Canadian delegations where, one, he shows up about an hour late habitually for those meetings, but he will come in, say, I don't really want to hear anything else. What are you guys going to do on supply management? What are you going to do with dairy? And if people don't have something to say, he's walked out with some of the leading CEOs in Canada. And the same can be said with Paul Ryan, Speaker Ryan for a while, soon to be not so Speaker. So here's the situation that we're in right now, and we can get to the specifics in a minute, is as we're getting a deal, anytime the U.S. has to make a concession on one of those areas, that's going to cost votes potentially on the final deal itself in Congress. So, we may say, let's just get a deal quickly here. If we get autos, we can then maybe punt on supply management. Well, you've lost 10, 15, maybe 20 votes. We have a huge whiteboard of every member of Congress, every vote they've ever taken, what letters they're signing on NAFTA, and what public statements they're making. It's remarkably inconsistent on the statements and letters that they're signing right now. But just looking at an abstract deal, I say we're about 45, 50 votes short, even in a lame duck year right now. And it's tough to do without a formal deal. But this is going to come down to old-fashioned horse trading. And the machinery right now isn't there to get a deal through. We talked with a lot of the folks that were around with the last NAFTA and got it through Congress. We are nowhere near the mobilization effort that we need to do to get a deal through. And we're not going to have a speaker, et cetera, et cetera. I'll just conclude kind of the broad strokes. For the auto industry, and this gets to John's point, the automotive rules of origin in NAFTA are extremely important to us right now, but Section 232 tariffs are even more important at this stage, particularly the exemption for Japan. Because high-grade specialty steel that's in every spring in an automobile, and I don't care how technologically sophisticated your automobile is, it has springs in it. That specialty steel is made in the Netherlands and Japan. And you can add other components to that. And it's not just
My clients.
and it's not just used in Honda here that creates 5,000 jobs here in Ohio, or Nissan in Tennessee. It's used across vehicle platforms. So if we're not able to get some of those specialty steels in that quite frankly U.S. companies can't make, we don't have the capacity really, right, or the capability right now. But even if we did, the tonnage is so small, it's not worth them to do it, to be honest with you. So we need to bring that in, or else these assembly lines are going to start shutting down in the next 90 days. So 232, hopefully when the Japanese are here next week, we can get that problem solved relatively quickly. But that brings me to the first specific proposal that we have, is that the automotive rule of origin discussion has a component in it which will require 70% of all aluminum, steel, and glass to be made within the region, meaning in North America. Right now, as of a couple days ago, that was only for auto. Right now, it's expanding to all tariff classifications. So it's not just aluminum and steel and glass in the automotive industry, it's for appliances and other types of people. So the idea is if we could get folks to sign on to that, then you'll get your permanent exemption on May 1st.
From the 232
From the
tariffs.
232s. So the auto-RU discussion in NAFTA right now, which is taking place over the last few days, is having an effect on the 232 discussion, because we're up against two, as was stated earlier, two real procedural deadlines. We have the TPA deadline, where I think we're past time, to be honest with you, but some may be able to fudge this for a few weeks. We're to get a deal even through the statutory mechanisms, we're out of time. But also we have this May 1st deadline on the steel and aluminum tariffs, which I think are, we can talk more about the specific proposals, but that's the big issue right now, is because the Mexicans showed up thinking they can get a deal, and all of a sudden they were told the 70% would apply across the board on all tariffs. And they said, whoa. Because contrary to, as I said, was stated earlier in a question for those of you that weren't here, the Mexicans came to Washington ready to make a deal on should they get the 3 points, auto, seasonal produce, and Chapter 20. And I realize the practical challenges, but EPN and Vigore's strategy was to try to get this through in their lame duck in September, where they still have majorities in the Senate. Practical, a lot of challenges to do that. But and I agree with Jeff's comments earlier. I think it's pipe dream to try it. But they were, and then they showed up and realized that Lighthizer was going to squeeze every drop of blood he could, and so the pause button is on. Now, there's some other proposals we can talk about, but overarching strategy, that's the problem. But the third final point that I'll make has to do with what was said earlier when Jeff commented on the view of USTR toward Canada. And it's something that those of us that advocate in the Canada-US relationship confront quite frequently at USTR with their views with Canada. And it's not only because Canada's strong negotiators, it's because they see Canada as running against those objectives. Specifically on, it's one thing to say diversification, and do a CP, TPP, TPP. It's another thing when we're trying to close the back door to China and Canada's over talking about opening a trade deal with China in December. And I think that changed some of the tenor and tone of these negotiations, and the complaint that the Canadian government filed against the United States challenging all of the trade remedies, ostensibly as part of the softwood lumber debate, really did sour some of theirs. So I would expect that one of USTR's requests to keep the steel exemption, steel and aluminum exemption, will be that Canada will have to withdraw that second WTO complaint, which, for those of you that may not be familiar with this, Canada essentially pulled a WTO complaint off the shelf that challenged the way that the U.S. calculates remedies in many, many cases, where the overwhelming majority of the products were claims that were brought against China. Right, so that was mixed messaging. At the same time that we're saying we make things together, we build things together, we're in this together as a North American community. Let's talk about a North American platform. We're talking about doing it. Canada's talking about doing a deal with China and bringing claims against the U.S. to not enforce trade remedies. Now, it was for a specific purpose in softwood, but I think so. That's why we get to Montreal. And you have to ask yourself, as a Canada-U.S. community, a year into the NAFTA negotiations, we have Bob Lighthizer standing on a stage defending Mexico and chastising Canada. Like, something has gone terribly wrong in terms of positioning at that point. Now, I think over the last few months, we've gathered things together, and I think there is an opportunity to have a more reasonable discussion. But that mixed messaging was a big issue for those of us that were going on to the Hill and meeting with USTR and elsewhere throughout most of the last 6-8 months, as we would hear, yeah, Canada wants to shut the back door, then why are they trying to do a trade deal with China, right? And so that's why it was very important for Canada. I think the Trudeau government did a great job with the 232 tariffs, was saying they would up their enforcement efforts as well in terms of monitoring things at the border and the like. So I'll stop there. We can get into the specifics, but overall vision, that's where we are right now.
I want to unpack a couple of these things for you, but first before doing that, let me talk a little bit about the last point that Dan made here, and you need to have it in perspective. And this is not a NAFTA issue, it's a China issue, but it affects NAFTA and affects the negotiations in precisely the way Dan mentioned. Over the last 2 administrations before the Trump administration, it was increasingly apparent that the focus of U.S. import relief concerns was going to be China, that there was discontent that China was not moving toward the market-oriented view that we thought they were going to move toward, which was the basis of our admitting them to the WTO. There was a reluctance in both the Bush and the Obama administrations to do, quote, protectionist things, that is, things that were like the 232, an artificial imposition of tariffs without an attack on unfair practices. And so all the China issues were funneled into Department of Commerce anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases, and the Department of Commerce, with the encouragement of the politicos, adopted a number of internationally controversial techniques to inflate anti-dumping and countervailing duty measures, and they are things like adverse facts available, something called particular market situation, treating China as a non-market economy, use of zeroing or some permutation of zeroing. All of these are now actually under challenge in the WTO, both by Canada and a number of other countries, and they're going to come up for a decision at the panel level this fall. Unfortunate time for that to happen at a time for a whole bunch of those decisions to start coming down the road against the U.S. just at the time when we've got midterm elections coming on. And Canada is seen as a country that has been at the heart, shouldn't have been at the heart, because this was not originally focused on Canada. It was focused on China, but Commerce Department adopts a policy and uses it against China, and then says, well, we can't be seen to be discriminating against China, so we got to use it against everybody else. And so other countries, including Korea, the EU, and Canada, have attacked them, and Canada has done a particularly comprehensive attack. That has been a real, and that is, you have to understand that this administration's trade bureaucracy comes from a tough anti-dumping, countervailing duty enforcement culture, particularly steel industry people. I refer to the USTR and Commerce as the Steel Protectionist All-Stars, because that's the people who have been appointed there, including Bob Lighthizer. That affects NAFTA, but not so much autos directly, but it affects the Chapter 19, it affects the U.S. attitude toward Canada. Let me come to move that aside for just a second, and let me go to sort of a broader reaction I have to what was just said by the various people here. I think back to the days when NAFTA was first being brooded about, the policy that led to NAFTA was being developed, and the idea was a very sort of idealistic vision of making North America a more competitive international entity. That is, taking the strengths of Canada, the strengths of the United States, and the strengths of Mexico, and finding a way to put them together to make us all more competitive against the world. And if you think about that in terms of autos, and think about what that meant, you find that it was advantageous to the industry because the industry got developed supply chains, it developed cooperation among the three countries, and was basically has become more competitive than it would have been without this. But, and this is a criticism or at least an observation as to what has seemingly gone wrong with globalization writ large, is that we haven't paid attention to the losers. And the losers tends to be the industrial workers. And that is where the big problem has been. You have production move to of autos moved to Mexico, both autos and auto parts moved to Mexico, primarily to get a favorable labor rate. So you come to, if you take that as the heart of what's wrong, what's seen to be wrong with NAFTA, then what you should be saying is, right, how do we do a deal in which we can address that somehow while still maintaining as much as we can of the joint competitiveness of the North American economies? And that's a difficult issue, and it's one that I'm disappointed that we don't really address. We look at this as individual pockets of issues, as Dan just went through, and we don't look at this as a holistic kind of exercise as to what should we be doing to protect workers in the two industrialized countries while we are increasing the competitiveness as a whole. And how does that come about in the NAFTA discussions? Well, there's the argument that, well, Mexico ought to have a higher minimum wage. We've heard that said by two of our panelists here as being a non-starter at Mexico's standpoint, and I think that maybe is right. There may be some room for negotiation on that, but you're certainly not going to get Mexico to a $15 an hour minimum wage. You can do rules of origin so that the minimum content from the U.S. and Canada, and particularly the U.S., in order to get entitled to the free trade agreement benefits is higher. But understand there's a limit to what that means. That means a lot for trucks because there's a 25% U.S. tariff. Doesn't mean a hell of a lot for autos because there's a 2.5% tariff there. Or you could do things like, and this is kind of I'm almost embarrassed to say it because who would think this is a good idea, to make investment in Mexico more risky by getting rid of or watering down investor-state dispute settlement. Now let's put that aside because we'll leave that for the next panel to deal with that hot potato. But the question is, where can we go on this? And I'd like to have us all talk a little bit about what are the proposals that are being made now and where we stand. Is there any room for play on negotiation on wages? Is there any, where could you go on rules of origin? From an original U.S. proposal, which was 70% rule of origin in other words, you had to have 70% of your content be from a NAFTA country to be entitled to the favorable treatment, plus 50% of the content had to be from the United States. Now you move to the 50% I think has been sort of pulled back, although I'm not sure it's entirely off the table. 70%, I say, has been broadened beyond autos to go to every autos and everything but the kitchen sink. Or maybe kitchen sinks are in that. Well,
yeah, they are in there.
They are in there. Yep. Okay. Where does all this, Dan, you're probably on top of the current state of what the proposals are more than anybody else here.
Yeah, well, the original proposal by the U.S. was to take the 62.5 that we have had, and as you said, bump that up to 85% total, and 50% of that being U.S. made. Not a lot of clarity there on the 50%. For example, some of our clients that do seating, and the frames coming from that state up north in Ohio foam is coming from the Carolinas. It's all sent to assembly into Mexico and comes back. Would it still have its U.S. character? A lot of problems with the proposal. I should also add one of the things that didn't get a lot of press because you get complicated was expanding the tracing list. Adding more things that would never count toward North America.
Explain that a little bit, because that's kind of we talk about tracing list, and while I think this is a fairly educated group, that 70% of them here know what they mean by tracing list, what we mean is...
I think the easiest way to say it is stuff that'll never count toward the NAFTA, or we have to always know where it's coming from. And
in other words, your intellectual property or your labor content or something like that historically has not been treated as part of your of what counts toward the 85%, and 50% things would be counted in there.
Yeah, well, so we were sitting there at that 85-50 and kind of a squishy room as to, would there be things, and it was something that was talked about in the great luncheon speaker, which is shutting that back door, tightening the rules on substantial transformation, so goods that could come in from overseas. And I will say, I think there was an enlightened view developing about this time last year. So you started to hear Secretary Ross, who's frankly less relevant now than then, but would talk about a North American production platform.
Right.
And
remember, Ross is the businessman in this crew in the administration, as opposed to Lighthizer,
an ex-auto guy,
an ex-auto guy, but also an ex-steel guy, and also an ex-textile guy. But as opposed to Lighthizer, who is I come up this through a career having spent in bringing trade cases on behalf of U.S. industries seeking protection from imports.
And then in that vein, so what went from there is we were basically at impasse for a while, but we were starting to go well. Actually, the Mexicans, I thought, who have played their hand beautifully up until recently, started to say, hey, we admit that about 3 to 5% of stuff in the North American supply chain probably is coming from Asia. And so in industry itself, we were starting to say, our blanket certificates of origin that we've had, stuff in Mexico, we don't always know if it's coming from Mexico, it's coming from other parts of the Americas. We could probably tighten this up and come up with a nice, good rule of origin that works. And then unfortunately, I think a lot of the other developments took over that we've talked about throughout the day. And we came into Montreal at the end of January, and Canada made a presentation, not a proposal, which basically advanced something that the Boston Consulting Group, working with MEMA and others, and the global automakers had come up with, which was focused value, which is really a more enlightened view of, which essentially is the body in white of the vehicle, which is the frame of the vehicle, BIW. Is that things below that we wouldn't really care about. So things that are, and this I'm aggregating a bunch of different presentations and proposals, but we'll just say we started moving in this direction where screws, nuts, washers, things that we don't really make efficiently here, we'd have either lower rule of origin thresholds or they wouldn't count, we wouldn't care. But what we wanted to do is keep high value components made. So the steel and aluminum would be made here in North America, and then we would start tiering the components. And the hope was over time is that 85 would start to diminish. Why? Because if you're in the industry, like the number is always about 74% of the most North American automobile is a Toyota. It's also a Ford. It's pretty darn close. Is around 73, 74. If you go to Magna, if you go down the supply chain, most of it's all around 70, 73%. So say at your average auto company, a tier one will have a $250 million procurement spend. About $100 million and change, more than half of it will actually be directed by the original equipment manufacturer. So the D3 will tell them where to buy that stuff. Then they'll have a lot of discretion over the rest, but most of that's coming from North America because, quite frankly, they have to source from local places, usually just for transportation costs. So most of them will say about 50 million probably is NAFTA non-compliant. And if you looked at them, wink, wink, smile, smile, hey, Dan, we could probably do like 70% rule of origin. 85 would kill us. The other component of the broader focused value is, as Dick said, we would start counting things we haven't counted, R&D, sales costs, things that were high value that we're doing here in North America already. And so part of that Mexicans kind of admitting 3 to 5% is Mexicans were saying, hey, let's shut that down because that stuff's coming from Asia anyway. Those OEMs that are directing 100 million are telling our people in Mexico to buy from Asia anyway. Let's shut that down, and we'll just that'll benefit us here in Mexico. So we started moving in the right direction, and then really what happened from January to March of this year, the Mexicans really expressed more of a willingness to reach a deal. So we really haven't flushed out the contours of that, and that's happening as we speak. But then the U.S. came back because USTR Lighthizer has been hit pretty hard on where's the labor proposal. So I flew up on the plane to the Montreal round with Congressman Sandy Levin from Detroit, who is not exactly a pro-NAFTA person. And I said, Congressman, why are you bringing this congressional delegation up? A bunch of Democrats came up. It was bipartisan, but mostly Democrat. And they said, we're up here to remind everybody, if there's a deal, it's got to have strong labor provisions. And then Lighthizer got hammered in Congress. And so the reality was, but as was said earlier, there's a labor chapter, and there had been talk of putting a wage provision in the labor chapter. But as I said, the Mexicans could never agree to a flat labor proposal. So there is some brilliance in the Lighthizer proposal, which is we'll put a wage figure associated in the rule of origin. So now what we have right now is the numbers are fluid right now, last count. Their high-value products will be at 75% rule of origin, transmission, certain components, and they'll have a North American average wage associated with it of roughly $15. It depends on how you do the math. Mexico has a very complicated structure on how you pay wages, so there's no methodology developed for that anyway. So developing a North American average wage is going to be very complicated to do because of how Mexico pays their employees. But then there'll be a next tier at 70, 65, and those numbers, I don't want to go on the record with those because I think they'll move. But the reality is the Mexican private sector, the Cuarto Junto, the side room has instructed the negotiators to the extent that it can, that they don't even want Mexico talking on a wage proposal. So as of yesterday, there hadn't been much progress on anything that includes wages. But that gets back to the politics. Can we have a NAFTA that doesn't deal with the wage issue and still get through Congress? So,
well, with that sort of state of play in mind, let me turn to both Buzz and John, and Buzz from the labor standpoint and John from an industry standpoint. It seems to me that if you're looking at it as from an industry, from a U.S. and Canadian industry standpoint, and your focus is Mexico and what we're doing to address the fact that Mexico stands out there as an attraction to shift production to Mexico or to maintain production in Mexico. Seems to me that the companies are looking at this and probably saying, what does this mean for our value chains? Does it mean that we can essentially keep them the way they are, or do we have to start bringing that production back to the States, if so, and Canada? From a labor standpoint, it means, does that really mean something to us? Does that really get something that really benefits American labor, which would be in terms, I guess, of higher wage rates in Canada, or a less attraction to U.S. companies to put plants in Canada? So if you two could sort of talk about how this might resonate, how this sort of negotiation might resonate with the two constituencies.
You made the point earlier about North American competitiveness.
Right.
And everybody has long said that part of North American competitiveness vis-a-vis other parts of the world is you need to have a low-cost supplier in the mix. Europe has it, Asia has it. So all of this, at least to some extent, starts to make that lower cost part of the equation higher cost.
Right.
So we accept that, and that's in the ideal theoretical world, something that you be a little careful how far you go on. And what's been raised too is complexity and the question to which some new rules are going to upset the way people have been doing business and force them to reinvent things, and all of that costs money. All of that involves uncertainty that is afoot. So there's some problems there. But as I heard Dan describing this tiering of wage, though it will be extremely difficult in the details. It sounds to me more like an incentive, or it would be structured to be an incentive to do things in the U.S., and by definition that would probably also mean Canada, as opposed to doing it in Mexico. It would try and get the high value production even more solidly. And at the end of the day, you certainly could have a package that is politically saleable, that may not be something that has done a huge amount to throw out the competitiveness, but it's headed in the right direction. Is that good enough for labor? Tip of the hat, maybe a little bit more, but it's pretty hard, as I think we had somebody earlier in the day talking about, in terms of trying to jack up wages in Mexico.
Thank you, John. Firstly, I'm just thrilled to be here. I've learned more today about what's going on from Dan and John and Dick than I have reading the papers and talking to some of my own people who are close to the negotiations. I want to deal with the first point that Dick made, and that is, can we be competitive as a North American entity? And if you look at pre-NAFTA, we in North America, we exported about 3% of our production to the rest of the world. And guess what? Today it's about 3%. There's been no change because we don't lump the three countries together and let's take a median cost thing and try to reach that. Everybody's grasping for their own. As we've watched the Mexican automobile industry increase from around 780,000 vehicles pre-NAFTA to over 2 million vehicles today, and within the next 3 years, they're claiming they're going to be over 4 million vehicles they're going to produce. We are producing now 4 million vehicles more a year than we did when NAFTA was signed back in '89. But Canada's had no advantage from that, not one iota. The U.S. has had some advantage, but Mexico has picked up over 80% of the production of that increase in vehicles since NAFTA was introduced. So there's nothing that I've heard today, or nothing on the table that I'm aware of, or quite frankly, nothing I can think of that would allow us to be able to compete in an international market. You look at what's happening with the European Union and the trade agreements. When you bring in countries like Romania and start building vehicles in Czechoslovakia and some of those countries, they're going to be North America's Mexico. And as Dan pointed out, Asia already has all of these low-cost producers in China and in Vietnam, and so there's a whole. So I don't see much hope for that changing very much. The one thing that could be done is the ability to unionize. That's the problem in Mexico. They got unions in Mexico, but they're what the labor movement refers to as ghost unions. And I'm not just talking about North American labor movement, but the European labor movement refer to them as ghost unions. And the company, if they're going to make an investment, they call up the government-controlled unions and invite them in. They sign an agreement before there's a shovel in the ground or before a worker is hired, and the terms of the agreement are settled then at $2 or $3 an hour. And in Mexico, that's a pretty good wage in a lot of communities in Mexico. So something in NAFTA to require legitimate independent unions. There'll be a lot of people that will choke on that around the negotiating table, but that is the reality. That's the only way I know if you're going to be able to take advantage and force up the labor costs in Mexico. That happened in Canada. We were several dollars an hour, I just forget the exact numbers, in 1965 behind the Americans in terms of nominal hourly rates. And in 1967, when we ratified our agreement, it brought us to full parity in each country's currency by 1970. We still got a letter, I got a copy of it, from not the Trudeau of today, but his father, who was prime minister of the day, criticizing our union for taking away the advantages under the free trade agreement by negotiating wage parity with the Americans. So it can work if you have legitimate unions as part of this agreement. And I don't know how Mexico could argue against that publicly. How do they stand up and say, we don't want, or we don't accept that there's going to be legitimate unions in our country?
Dan, you had something to say about
Yeah, I just wanted to say too, I wanted to add, I want to re-emphasize if I didn't say it at the beginning, I'm not suggesting in any way either me nor Dickinson Wright agree with these proposals. Just to be very clear on that, I'm just saying if that is the objective, this is what they're trying to do. But my concern is threefold on what we're seeing right now. One is there's a compliance burden that companies right now are barely meeting compliance burden. The compliance on rules of origin as they exist at present are already so problematic. We see companies, there's a barrier to entry, companies forego using them, adding these additional requirements. It's going to be great for customs brokers. And trade lawyers. I mean, it's going to be wonderful if it comes into fruition. The second is, practically speaking, it is going to kill suppliers, because a lot of the movement that we're seeing into Mexico today is very rarely due to wages. Most of these companies right now are following the original OEMs. So they need to be within a certain radius of the part. They need to be in the auto production part. Mexico has done a great job of giving incentives to companies to come down. So we talk about the cars that cross the border 6 to 12 times during the assembly process between Detroit and Windsor. In Mexico, the car is being assembled from loading dock to loading dock in the same assembly part. So those suppliers that are presently in Canada, in the United States, are taking financing to go down and to set up shop in Mexico, assuming political risk, all of those things. They're running on shoestring budgets anyway. Now you've just increased their labor costs. And that cost does not get passed on to the OEMs. If anybody that knows how the OEMs work with the supplier, you figure out a way to make that cost work or you're gone, you're out. And you don't get back in. Usually Paul and others could talk more about that. So that additional cost is not going to get passed on. The supplier is going to have to figure out, and where that's going to hit is back here. And they're going to start laying people off in Canada and Mexico, so it's going to have the opposite effect. And last but not least, I don't think the administration objective is to bring back the facilities that are in Mexico now. That will take decades to do so, because it's in terms of encouraging new investment. So you try to change that calculus that the auto companies are using, where they figure out where to invest, right? It's a large algorithm, essentially. If you start figuring out supplier costs, all those things, maybe, but guess what? That ain't going to be Michigan, Ohio, and Ontario at the end of the day. So where this is a significant part of the president's base, this is not going to be the place where you're locating your next big automotive supply plant. It's going to be in the U.S. Southeast, most likely, which are right to work states. So
Toyota Mazda just took a decision.
Yeah, absolutely.
And where was it? Alabama.
Exactly. So I think these are things that I think look good on paper. They sell to Congress, but the practical consequences are not going to be what the administration thinks that they're going to be.
Another way to put it might be it could be presented as a win for the U.S., for the administration, if there are no further OEM plants going into Mexico in the foreseeable future, and whatever the rules are, give the public, labor, others comfort that that's going to be the case. But, gee, how do you do it?
I listened to part of this, and I think one of the most brilliant strategies for us could be to get Lopez Obrador elected president of Mexico, and then you'll have political risk that'll prevent anybody from investing there. But that's a joke, I think, I hope. I don't know.
Very real.
At any rate, let me, at what you just said, John, let me come back to where you started out in our discussion before, and that is that the essence of decisions made by governments on trade issues relating to these big important industries like autos is politics, and the politics overwhelm the economics. And if you look at it that way, I'd like us to talk a little bit about whether something can come out of here that Trump can ballyhoo as saying, I promised and I did it, and be believed. Now, let me say as an introduction to that, that in a less heated milieu, namely Korea, we just did a deal which Trump and Lighthizer have said, see, we did great things for the automobile industry. Those of us who know anything about the deal, and those of us who know anything about U.S.-Korea auto trade, know that it's pretty damn near totally cosmetic. It has two aspects. One is that Korea has more rigid environmental and mileage and safety regulations than the United States. But we had a provision. Full confession, I negotiated this provision in the original course, that up to 25,000 U.S. cars per year can come in and be certified to sell in Korea, even though they meet only the U.S. regulations, not the stricter Korean regulations. The problem, we in this new deal, we've said we're going to increase that to 50,000. That would be real meaningful if we'd ever gotten near the 25,000. We never had. We never got above 20,000. The other part of the deal was we would, there's a, as we've said before, 25% tariff in the U.S. on light trucks. And that was scheduled under course to expire in 2021, and we have extended that for 20 years, till 2041. The only problem is Koreans don't sell light trucks in the United States and don't have any plans to do so, and if they did so, they would probably produce them in the two Hyundai and Kia plants here in the United States. So my point in saying that is not to talk about folly in U.S. negotiating or anything like that. I can do another hour on that anytime you want, but rather to say that there are ways in which Trump has been able to, on this and some other issues, say, I made my promise, I came through and I did it, even though somebody looking really close at it might say, wait a minute, it's not all that meaningful. So, but NAFTA's under the spotlight a lot more. NAFTA's here. NAFTA's right on our borders. So how does Trump come out of this a political winner? And what is he? Because the reason I say this is such an important issue is it strikes me that there comes a point at which Trump and Lighthizer and the team that's doing this have to make a decision. Do we come out a political winner by doing this, or do we do the only other way in which we could make ourselves a political winner, which is to engineer a shutdown of the NAFTA negotiation talks? And I say that very clearly because I think now they've set it up so Trump doesn't walk away from the talks. What Trump does is he says no exemption from the steel and aluminum tariffs for Canada, no exemption for Mexico, and the Mexicans say, we're not going to negotiate, and the Canadians say, we're not going to negotiate NAFTA, and Trump then says, good, it's all over, and I'm leaving the talks. But so it seems to me there's a time that comes where Trump's going to be faced with the decision, I either have got something that I can ballyhoo as a political victory, or I engineer a collapse of the talks. And is there a way to get to the first one?
I think we got our answer yesterday, in my view, when the president's comment. I'm from the school of thought, and being engaged in politics in this part of the world, that getting a deal doesn't help him, in my view, because it's not going to get through Congress. So it's going to look like and he can blame Congress, but it's Republican Congress. I think saying that I've stopped automotive investment in Mexico because of the uncertainty, and I'm beating the hell out of the Canadians and Mexicans, and I'm loads coming in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think the limbo is a political win for the president right now. And members of Congress, look, NAFTA's not a four-letter word itself, but if you say it in this part of the country, you're going to hear a four-letter word. I mean, that's just the way it is here. There is not somebody running
5 letters.
There isn't somebody, but you're going to hear a four-letter word. I mean, the F in NAFTA is usually North American F in trade agreement, right? In this part of the country, and there isn't a member of Congress that wants to touch this issue right now. It's political dynamite. It's right now it's very quiet, but it could blow up. The farmers are already driving everybody, in everybody's hall. So in my view, I don't think there's anything that they could put on the table right now that could get this through Congress, because look, Ed, if you get a win for labor, who's going to back? Just take right now what we got. You're probably going to get a deal with that investor state dispute settlement. You're not going to get the chamber's resources to support that deal. You're not going to get the business roundtable's money. I just think we all have to appreciate that this isn't 1993, 1994 again. The politics are much, much worse. We are not mobilized R&D in the same way. The politics of trade are very different right now, not just here in the Midwest, but throughout the country. The real steam to get a deal right now is coming from Texas, from the Texas delegation, from Kevin Brady, chairman of House Ways and Means. Why? Because Houston's invested a ton of money in Mexico right now, in Mexican energy reform. And so they're saying, get a deal before AMLO gets in there so we can lock it down. But I'm not sure, that's not where the president's base is located. So I'm optimistic that we'll have an agreement in principle, say, here's the 80% of the things we agree upon. We're working on autos. It looks like this, Canada, Mexico, you're going to get your exemption, and we'll go beat up on China for the next 9 months. But because I just don't see a win any other way.
So would anybody like to follow that supremely optimistic assessment with anything that's of a different tenor?
I think I would, don't have reason to disagree with that. I think Trump is currently in a very comfortable position. The jawboning that he's done has kept anybody from putting a new automotive plant, and he said yesterday that that's the case. And if anybody doubts that he won't continue to do that, he sent a shot across Jeff Pesto's bow the other day. He's going to keep doing that kind of thing. In the meantime, I think in some of the public eye, he's got, seems to get wins on Korea. I'd be very surprised if there aren't some concessions that the Chinese have already started to move towards. And if he's comfortable enough that it's status quo, no further action with Mexico, then he's doing okay. But if there is some real genius that can come up with something simple that it would come under much, much more scrutiny, the content requirements, new content requirements for NAFTA than Korea has or other things. If he can get something there, I think he might want to move. But he's got to be able to get it through Congress, and it's always been tight run with the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and this just doesn't seem to me, I'm not the expert any longer.
Any thoughts on this, Buzz, or you want to?
Yeah, just quickly. I think he's concentrating on the wrong enemy, so to speak. And I agree with Dan and John. I don't think there's going to be a deal, and limbo is where we're going to end up, and limbo is going to be a victory for this portion of his trade agenda. But what's still sitting out there where he could really make some inroads, and people are really concerned about, is the level of imports that are still coming in to our market, North America, from mostly U.S. and Canada, but from Japan, Asia. There's not much comes in from China. And Europe, and it's going to increase with the European Union trade agreement. You're going to see lower cost going into the vehicles, and those imports are going to increase. So taking a harder line on the imports and demanding a level of content on them would help rebuild the auto parts industry in the United States almost overnight, almost like the Auto Pact did when it was signed back in 1965.
So on that note, we're running close to, I'm going to cut you off because we got to go to some questions here. We've run over as we always do, but, well, yes, sir.
John Johnson. Point of clarification, I mean, this is a technical thing with rules of origin, but I think it's important, is where tracing fits into it. And the way cars, and I'll just deal with cars, the way I understand it, you start out with the concept of total cost, and that's everything, all costs. And you subtract some things from that aren't particularly relevant other than royalties. But royalties aren't subtracted if they're used for developing software in North America. Okay, so that's your base, and that's your denominator. Now, the only thing you subtract from that are items that are in the car that are imported into the NAFTA territory from outside the NAFTA territory under specified tariff provisions. And they're just a list of auto parts, engine parts, and wheels, and whole host of things like that. Specific list. So everything that in the car that is on that list counts against the producer. Everything else counts in favor of the producer. So that means that things like research, development, development of software, all that stuff counts. Now, when you're describing this notion of having wages being part of it and so on, that just doesn't fit into this template. They must be contemplating something totally different.
It's focus value.
Yeah.
It's an entire different methodology.
Yeah, because that metric, I mean, and the tracing it's a very cumbersome concept, but it's totally alien to what seems to be on the table. Now, I don't understand what's on the table. Maybe you do a bit.
Yeah. I think that's a great point.
Yeah.
A lot of the reporting on this has tried to fit the new methodology into the old wineskin, so to speak, and that we're coming up with a whole different, or not we, but allegedly they are. Let me just say that the methodology is the proposal that the U.S. gave recently, tabled, did not include methodology. To any degree of that. So I think it was commented earlier that we were still at the concept stage. Now we're talking tiers and brackets, but that point in and of itself suggests to me that it's going to take months, if not years, to figure out what components are in, and they're trying to do this now. I don't. It's a whole different kettle of fish.
One of my favorite television shows from my youth was called Monty Python's Flying Circus. It always began with John Cleese sitting at a desk saying, "And now for something completely different." And everything I see in the Trump administration fits that. Sure, John.
John, you talk about the Canada-U.S. rules of origin and the troubles with that. And the NAFTA rules came along, and it's a lot of clarity. I think one of the critical things in that clarity was uniform regulations. Is that we actually, John Simpson, the U.S. negotiator, Sandy Morose, and the Mexicans agreed that the regulations putting the rules of origin into effect in all three countries were harmonized, and they were. Totally. The only differences, the rule differences, because of differences in the tariff schedules. And that had a huge amount of clarity. You could not work with the NAFTA text as it was. There are all kinds of things in the tracing and the rest of it we couldn't deal with. And we settled all that stuff in the uniform regulations. If we ever come to an end of this thing, I would urge the three governments to adopt that approach. Because I really think it will work out.
If they're ever smart enough to hire you as an advisor, we'll be a lot ahead of the game. Yeah. Jim, you had a question.
Jim Peterson, what percentage of the cost of a car is labor?
The 5% is what Ray Tanguay, who formerly Toyota Motor Manufacturing Canada, and until a week or two ago, special advisor to the Canadian and Ontario government, says 5%.
Has that come down a lot in recent years?
And that's about what our union uses, well, around 5%, and yes, it's come down. I think when NAFTA come in, it was probably closer to 17-18%.
That's what I thought. Wow. Yeah.
Paul Vandevert. That question though goes actually to what John was talking about, because that question comes up all the time. How much, what's the value of the steel in a car? What's the value of the labor content? What's the value of the U.S. origin parts? I mean, there are parts in there that are made in the United States.
Sure.
You should be able to count it. The rules go negative. And so nobody knows. It's a you can do a very informed opinion, but as far as all the worker bees that every day qualify goods for NAFTA, even just in the automotive industry, it's all negative. They're only counting non-originating content. And I think that you're going to have failed discussions forever until you get to a method, which I think the focus value, I will admit I don't fully understand the focus value, but until you get to a build-up method of counting what originates, will you ever be able to get the discussion in the popular mind of just so how much does originate?
Mm-hmm.
Your question assumes that it's possible to understand focused value. My dad always described Einstein's theory as the theory that explains why it's hotter in the summer than in the city, and focused value may be much like that. And if there are no other questions, I want to thank you all. We've certainly enjoyed this, and hope it's been somewhat enlightening for all of you.